overview of housing in DC.
So I promise not to, I'm going to try to hit all of your acronyms so that we have a sense of those. I know we've hinted at acronyms. So first thing I want to talk about is some of these terms that I'm going to be using while we're going through this. So when we say subsidized housing, what do we mean? Subsidized housing is kind of our catch-all term that we're talking about public housing. We're talking about any sort of voucher that supports the payment of rent. We're talking about any situation where it's not just a tenant going out on the private market, paying out of their pocket directly to the landlord and having a discrete relationship. So that's what we're talking about, kind of this catch-all term. And the majority of clients that we see, I would say way over 50%, are in some sort of subsidized housing. So we're going to walk through each of those different types so you have a sense when you hear those different terms. HUD. So HUD is the federal agency for housing. They do oversee some of the types of housing that we work with in DC. It can be very complex for our tenants to know who's actually in control of their housing, who are we actually suing, who do we seek redress from. So sometimes HUD does come up. Department of Human Services comes up for us for families who have experienced homelessness. So these are primarily families in what's called rapid rehousing, which we'll discuss what that program is. But typically that's when we see Department of Human Services involved. DCHA is our kind of federal, kind of local housing authority. They oversee all of our public housing here. They also oversee the majority of our voucher programs. So many times they are the landlord that we're actually suing. Sometimes they are just the payment stream for the housing. So we're going to talk about how they get involved. But DCHA, they're on North Capitol Street, right by NPR's office. You've probably driven past them. And families that go to North Capitol Street to recertify their income every year, those families likely have housing that's owned by DCHA. The housing quality standards are HQS. These are the standards that the government uses to assess whether housing is appropriate and safe and healthy. This is not the same as DC Housing Code, which is the law in DC about what is required in your housing. So, as you might suspect, those don't always align. Sometimes the government's standards are not quite as stringent as the housing code, and we'll talk more about the housing code, but sometimes we'll see the quality standards mentioned. DCRA, another DC department, they are kind of our inspection agency. Families don't need a lawyer to just call them up and ask that a DCRA inspector come out and walk through their home and inspect for housing code violations. So DCRA will actually send somebody in, they'll issue a report that says, here are the following violations, and the landlord needs to fix these issues. They technically issue a notice of violation. They could fine the landlord for failing to improve their housing conditions. We're seeing very, very weak enforcement from DCRA on that. They've very rarely follow through and actually billing the landlord, but it can be a good piece of information to know DCRA has been in this home 4 times in the past, and the landlord still has, they've been on notice, but they still haven't taken care of the issues in the home. So DCRA often pops up in our cases, and we'll talk about a bit more about their involvement as well. Okay, so in DC, who is a tenant? It is not quite as straightforward as you might think. The most obvious ones are obviously folks who have a formal lease. However, in DC, a lot of us, and myself included, we have a lease we signed and it expired years ago. Still a tenant. I had a formal lease. No formal lease. So these folks are people who are paying for a place to stay, but they never actually put something in writing. They are considered a tenant under DC law, and they can also seek redress in the same manner. And then finally, folks with an expired lease. So in DC, the end of a lease is not grounds to terminate the tenancy. It automatically reverts to a month-to-month tenancy. So lots of families are in this situation who have been there in any housing for more than a year. They're often in an expired lease situation. They still have the same rights as any other tenant. We also have some tricky situations where the landlord has been foreclosed upon. Suddenly, Bank of America is actually the landlord. And Bank of America is not a great landlord. They don't really want to come take care of the toilet when it's leaking. They are not thrilled to be a landlord. However, if they are still the owner of the property, that is the proper entity that we would sue for redress of the housing conditions. So those are fun situations because they don't really want to come to court or deal with that. And again, we talked about the end of a tenancy. So the end of a lease is not good cause to end the tenancy. Some good cause in DC would be it's let's say it's just a row house, it's privately owned, and the owner wants to move back in. That's good cause to end the tenancy. Other lease violations, you have 5 dogs in the home and there were no pets allowed. That would be a good cause to terminate the lease.
But I think the biggest thing is end of your lease is not good cause, right? So that's the biggest thing we hear is like your lease ended, you have to leave. That's not good cause. So just because your lease ended, they can't force a tenant out. So they have to issue. Sorry, it's a bit complicated. Yeah. If it's not for non-payment of rent, so the biggest one we see is people don't pay their rent. If it's for non-payment of rent, they can just sue you and bring you to court. If it's not for non-payment of rent, they have to issue a 30-day notice, and you typically have 30 days to correct that violation. So if it's for the dogs, if you get rid of the dogs, they can no longer evict you. So most of our tenants, if they get a 30-day notice and they just correct, they can no longer move to evict the person. So that they typically have the opportunity to correct. Depending on some kinds of housing, if it's certain types of criminal violations, they may not have the opportunity to correct it. It gets complicated, but it doesn't usually come up in our cases, to be honest. The biggest issues are non-payment of rent that come up, and we won't. When we do intakes, if somebody owes a lot of money, we typically won't take that case, and we typically wouldn't place that case with you guys if they did owe a lot of money.
Yeah, we screen out tenancy issues. Did I answer your question? Okay. So we're going to run through each of these different types of housing. These are the kind of the most common types that we see in our cases, and so we're going to go through them in detail. But private housing, project-based Section 8, DC public housing, and rapid rehousing are the types that we often see. So private housing, as I mentioned, this is your kind of simplest situation. Tenant goes out on the private market, they sign a lease with the landlord. They're going to pay a certain amount of their income towards the rent every month. No government agency is involved in either the legal relationship or the financial relationship. Rather straightforward. Okay, project-based Section 8. So this is a situation where there's a private landlord, usually a corporation of some sort, who owns a property, and they get a subsidy per unit in that property, and the tenant enters into a lease with the private landlord, and then HUD is paying a portion of the tenant's rent. It's based on the income of the tenant. So HUD is going to have a direct relationship with the landlord. The tenant also has a direct relationship with the landlord. Things that are important to know about project-based Section 8 housing, they are each like entities unto themselves. So you cannot easily transfer from one to the next. So we have a lot of tenants who say, I have a lot of issues with my neighbors, or this is a really bad neighborhood. I don't want to live here anymore. I know this landlord owns another property. They don't actually have an automatic right to transfer from one property owned by the Smith Corporation to another property owned by the Smith Corporation. That's very frustrating for families. They also, if they were to move out of that property, they don't get to take the subsidy with them. So they could apply to another property that already has the subsidy, but they aren't actually getting to walk with that, and they also don't have any subsidy to just look on the private market for an apartment. So the subsidy stays with the unit. Most of these properties there's an oversight by HUD, and there's probably an on-site HUD kind of case manager. There's a wait list for most of these properties. It's super frustrating for tenants. They have to apply to each one individually. So that might mean going to 20 different properties throughout the city, applying, seeing if they have a wait list. A lot of them have some sort of designation, this is for seniors or this is for families with disabilities. There is a list online that you can pull, but it is a frustrating process for families because it's not centralized in any way. Okay, so public housing, yes. No, please, tell us. That's a great question. So the question is whether whether this project-based Section 8 is a voucher that you can transport to different locations. That's a separate program, and I'm going to get to that in half a second. Yeah.
It's also called Section 8.
It's also called Section 8, yeah, which is why it's confusing. So we always say project-based Section 8 or a Section 8 voucher, and we distinguish with, can they move? That's basically the question, yeah. The other way that we often, just so you know, when we're screening and trying to figure out who the landlord is when we get a case, we ask the tenant, where do you recertify your income every year? Where do you go and take all your income documents to determine how much you have to pay? If they go to just their property office on their property, it's probably project-based Section 8. If they go to DCHA, it's probably public housing or a Section 8 voucher. A great question. Okay, so public housing. These are properties throughout the city that are actually owned by DCHA. There's kind of a long history of these properties. It was taking 15, 20 years for a family to get off the wait list to actually get into a property. And so they just closed the wait list. You cannot get on the wait list right now. There's some exceptions, but it is very hard to get into public housing. So those populations tend to have been in those properties for a long time, or their family has been in that property for a long time. But new families who are homeless cannot get on the wait list right now. And part of that is they just hadn't culled the wait list. So there were families that were no longer homeless or people who had passed away who are still on this list. So there was this crazy long wait, and they finally closed it.
So they did call the wait list, and it's now like 40,000 people, and they're calling people from 2003. So there's still like no point of opening the wait list, because like I had a client who checked last week, and they're calling homeless families who were homeless in 2003 and still have to be homeless in 2019 to be eligible to be put off the wait list.
Some positive. So public housing is a direct relationship between the tenant and DCHA, which runs the public housing. So they're certifying their income to DCHA, but also DCHA is their landlord and responsible for all the housing code there. One positive about the public housing system is families can transfer from one to the next. So families do have the opportunity to get out of a bad neighborhood, get away from domestic violence, get away from housing conditions that don't meet their disabilities. There are priorities. It's in the law for how you get transferred. It's in the DCMR. Top priority is families experiencing domestic violence. But we are able to get families moved from one spot to the next. You may have seen in the news that there's all kinds of issues with DC public housing. They don't have the money they need to repair a lot of the units. So there's kind of a crunch right now to get families moved. They're saying, well, this property has such severe conditions, we have to move all these people. So other people who have been waiting for a transfer for a while, they're still going to be waiting for a while because there's some other more pressing needs. So historically financially strapped and really hard to get into. But once you're in, there are some positives because you can move around from public housing. Okay, so housing choice voucher program, this is traditionally known as Section 8 vouchers. So I think this is what you were thinking of. This is a relationship between DCHA, which manages the financial relationship, the tenant and the landlord, which will sign a lease, and then the landlord and DCHA, where DCHA is making sure that the housing meets the housing quality standards and agreeing to pay a portion of the rent. So families will pay 30% of their income and DCHA will pay the rest. The fantastic thing about this is families can take this voucher and go out on the private market and find any apartment that's within their income range. So that includes the whole country. They don't have to stay in DC, which is particularly helpful as housing is getting more and more expensive and families don't want to be stuck in these bad neighborhoods. They want to be able to move to other neighborhoods. So this is kind of like the golden ticket that everyone wants. They're not particularly easy to get. Families will get called. They're on a list. They get called. They have to certify their income and go through a process. But ultimately, once they get a voucher, it allows them most flexibility. And the idea here is that we're not going to concentrate neighborhood, have families in poverty all concentrated in the same area. We're allowed to, able to integrate them in communities throughout the city and throughout the country, which is a great model. Yeah. Section 8. So the question was, how's the relationship between DCHA and the landlord different in Section 8 situation versus in project-based Section 8? Project-based Section 8, it's HUD involved and not DCHA. That's the primary difference. Yeah.
And also, so in project, in here, like there's a triangle, right? So the tenant is signing a lease with DCHA, is signing an agreement with DCHA and the landlord, and they have obligations, like everybody has obligations to both. In project-based Section 8, it's sort of the same, but the HUD subsidy is going directly to the landlord, and the landlord is dealing with all the certification, all of the pieces of it, right? So basically the tenant is signing everything with the landlord, and the landlord is sending everything to HUD. The tenant is never dealing directly with HUD. Here, the tenant is dealing directly with both DCHA and the landlord. And if the tenant moves, the tenant keeps dealing directly with DCHA. If the tenant moves out of project-based Section 8, the landlord keeps the subsidy, right? Because the subsidy stays with apartment 101. So when the tenant moves out, apartment 101 keeps the subsidy in project-based Section 8. So the landlord keeps the relationship with HUD, and the landlord just moves the next tenant in and keeps that relationship with HUD. Here, because the tenant keeps the voucher, the tenant keeps the relationship with DCHA, and the landlord just gets, may or may not have a relationship with DCHA if they don't have a tenant in the next, with us, a voucher in the next tenancy.
Yeah, Candace.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So a family that has
Yeah.
if there are outside.
That's a great question. So the question was, who's responsible if there are housing code violations in a HCVP case? The landlord is responsible. So it's the owner of the property. So they're responsible for enforcing. Sometimes these are particularly tough situations because DCHA has inspected under their housing quality standards, and DCHA said, great, looks good. And then you go into the home and you're like, no, actually, there's all kinds of issues here. And we go into court or we call DCRA, and DCRA inspects and says, no, there's all kinds of housing code violations. And that's where those two standards don't always dovetail. And so that can be super frustrating. But ultimately, it's the owner of the property, the landlord, who's responsible.
And we're not going to get into this too much in this training, but actually the reverse can also be a problem.
Yeah.
If this comes up in a voucher situation, you should talk to your mentor, because the reverse can be a problem. You may not want to get DCHA involved at all in a voucher housing issue case, because if DCHA inspects twice and it fails twice, they will terminate the subsidy to the landlord, and it can force your client to have to move whether they want to or not. And for a lot of our clients, like that's a landlord's way of getting a client out sometimes, because they know that the subsidy will be terminated and will force the client to move. And so sometimes it's a way of a landlord getting a client, a troublesome tenant out that they don't want out. So there's a lot of strategy about when to bring DCHA in these cases. So talk to us before you bring in DCHA. So you don't have to remember that, but just before you bring DCHA in a voucher case, just remember that. Talk to us.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. Well,
Yes and no.
yeah, so I guess so two things. So one, it is illegal to discriminate for a source of income, and we are seeing that in DC. So we see that a lot, right? Families will post, or landlords will post on Craigslist, like, no vouchers. That's blatantly illegal. But we do see that a lot and continuing. The other piece is if DCHA says your voucher is worth, I don't know, $1,800 for a 2-bedroom, and you just can't find a property, you are getting families who are kind of stuck in certain places or don't have the security deposit.
So DCHA for their vouchers does change the payment standard for neighborhoods in the city, trying to make it more flexible that you can live in different neighborhoods. So they will pay more for neighborhoods that cost more, not up to the rental rates of some of the neighborhoods, but they do try to do it. It can be hard to rent with a voucher. They do give people 6 months to rent. If you have somebody who's getting to that 6 months, it's important that they rent up or they will lose their voucher unless they have a disability reason to get an extension. So again, red flag to talk to us about if they're hitting the limit. We've helped people file with the Office of Human Rights if they're getting discriminated against trying to find their voucher. It can be hard to find something. There is a lot of voucher discrimination. It is illegal in DC, but most of our clients have found something. So it's not, I know other parts of the country, people just literally can't use their voucher. I think people in DC are eventually able to find something, but it definitely can be tough.
Yeah.
But some people want to stay where they are. They like their house. So it's then strategizing how not to get the landlord to get them out.
Did you have a question?
So the question is by the number of people. It's by the number of people that are allowed to live per the voucher. So you get like a 5-bedroom voucher because you have you and your 6 kids on the voucher. So if you have extra people living in your house, you could get evicted. They could terminate your voucher because you have people that are not authorized to live in your voucher there. Yeah.
Yeah. There's like pretty complex standards about how they calculate how many bedrooms you're supposed to have based on the age of the children and the sex of the children and all sorts of things. But yeah, they calculate based on the number of people. Yeah. Yes.
Is there a program that's more preferred? A lot of our clients like the voucher program because it's the most flexible in terms of where you live. You get the most choice, and like you can move anywhere with it. Like with public housing, you have to live in public housing. You have to stay in DC. You can't move to like somewhere else in the country's public housing. But I think people are pretty glad just to get a subsidy. So
Yes.
okay, let's keep going so we can get through everything.
Okay, so this is just a handy chart you have in your packet there of who oversees whom. Kind of the big takeaway, project-based Section 8 is directly overseen by HUD, whereas pretty much everything else falls under DCHA.
And we want to say this is like 1/100th of the types of subsidized housing. So it's possible you will run into some other kinds of subsidized housing, but this is like 99% of what we actually see in our cases. So there's a lot of other kinds of subsidized housing out there. And if we run into it, we're happy to talk to you about it. But we don't train on everything because there's so many weird kinds of subsidies out there that it's just not worth it.
Okay, so the meat and potatoes, housing conditions law. So